So welcome back to part 3 of our series of talks with Victoria. So just as a summary, we've spoken about the journey of a dentist from associate principal to owning a practice to what next. We've now spoken about Victoria's journey, and we've got on to the part where we want to know more about Bitcoin, what it is and how it's been formed, and just enlightening those who don't really know much about it and want to learn all about it now. So Victoria?
Up until Bitcoin was invented, it was very, any kind of software could be copied, and it's still the case. I mean, ultimately, Bitcoin is a software program, and the whole program itself can be copied, and that's often where a lot of the altcoins come from. But the revolutionary thing that Bitcoin did was it created a way for software to remain unique by using a series of public and private keys, enabling transactions, and for all of those transactions to be consistently recorded and then verified. Essentially, it created a new kind of money. And when you looked at it, the software protocol seemed to have been designed very much around the monetary qualities of gold, because of course gold had operated very well for thousands of years, but of course it became a problem once we started relying on the banks as an intermediary. This was where the system went wrong. But the thing is, Bitcoin was only invented 12 years ago. So people had no choice up until 2009. But because we now had this new system that appears to be very robust. I mean, even since its inception, the Bitcoin network itself has never actually been hacked. I mean, there have been various exchanges that have been hacked, and there have been various other issues around the network. But the Bitcoin blockchain itself has proved to be extremely robust. And this is one of the reasons why Bitcoin itself has been literally the best performing asset of the last decade, because it solves a very big problem. And so this was the revolution that Bitcoin was. And of course, its most profound use case that was recognized very quickly by the people who were working on it was as a new form of money, and it was deliberately influenced, I think, by those who were unhappy about how the monetary system had developed, because there are a number of people who'd been researching this for a number of years. They understood that our existing monetary system is what's led to the explosion in house prices, which is making it harder and harder for ordinary people to buy a house. It's making it harder and harder for them to, we're already starting to see the rise of food prices, the effect on supply chains, all of which is being blamed on the pandemic. But actually, this situation has been brewing for a number of years and was going to come to a head anyway. In many respects, the pandemic and the difficulties with that have just accelerated the process. So there are a number of people who understood what the problems were and had been discussing it for a long time, those who had expertise and had been studying this problem for a long time. There were people, I mean, Richard Nixon, finally severed the last connection between paper money and gold in 1971. And so this has been the point at which we've really seen the stock market take off, the housing market take off. And this is, this is what's making it so difficult for people to live their ordinary lives. It's becoming harder and harder to get your foot on the property ladder if you're a young person, for example. And those who got into the stock market early, or who bought a house in the 70s or 80s, or even in the early 2000s, are finding that they're in a very good position. But those who've been to dental school, who've just left dental school, and now having to pay university fees that a lot of previous generations didn't have to pay, they're burdened with debt right from the beginning. And then one of the first things they have to invest in is a huge mortgage. And, this situation is creating huge imbalances in society, and in many respects is reaching a crescendo. People for a long time have predicted that this would end in catastrophe, and my personal belief is that if someone hadn't invented Bitcoin, then it would have been a catastrophe. Before Bitcoin had been invented, there were lots of people who had experimented on different forms of e-money, and just as the internet was being invented in the late 90s, there were people talking about, the real revolutionary service that we need is a form of e-money. And so a lot of people were working on it. And of course, one of the advantages of having all of our finances digitally, it sounds very convenient, but what you have to be aware of is that, behind the scenes, people are using that service in very nefarious ways. So China, for example, for the last 10 years has been using digital payment apps. Now if you go to China, it's really difficult to find anyone who accepts cash. But in tandem with that, they've also introduced a social credit score system where if you're not meeting certain criteria that's being dictated by the government, then you can have certain services cut off. So as much as computers make things convenient, if they're operated centrally, a bit like our government has and our monetary system has up until now, it's incredibly dangerous, and leaves individuals in a situation where they become more and more powerless to do anything about it. And I think in many respects, that's the way that the economy was going. I mean, I remember my dad's for many years has been a loyal advocate of The Economist magazine. And I remember in 1988, I was only 14, but I remember seeing the cover of The Economist, which had a phoenix on the front with a gold chain around its neck and a medallion that said 2018. So this would have been 20, 30 years before 2018. And it was sitting on a pile of burning money. Now, at the age of 14, that didn't mean anything to me. But now I look back on it, and you can still find that cover if you do an internet search on it. Now that I understand how money works, it's a lot more poignant. And what it demonstrates is that even as early as 1988, people understood that this problem with money was on the horizon, and they were talking about ways in which this problem could be solved. And so, things like digital currencies, I think for a long time were in the works. But like I say, one of the big advantages of a digital currency, especially if it's centralized, is the ability for manipulation from that centralizing power. So the beauty of Bitcoin is that it doesn't have that. It's been set up in such a way that you need a number of different actors for the whole system to work. And as a result, it's decentralized as opposed to some of these centralized currencies, because some of the early digital currencies were shut down very quickly. As soon as someone came up with a new innovation that was a form of digital cash, it was very easy for the government to come in and shut down whoever was running that project. And I think whoever invented Bitcoin saw that happen a number of times. And so by the time they came up with the final plan for Bitcoin, they made a point of keeping themselves anonymous. And so the original person who wrote the white paper, who's known as Satoshi Nakamoto, even to this day, no one knows who that is. Whoever they were literally a genius, not only because they invented it, but also because they learned to keep themselves anonymous so no one can come after them. And so this is the magic of it. And so this is one of the reasons why this technology has been able to take off, because no one can shut it down. And even now, if you talk to prominent economists, they all speculate about the point at which the government's kind of shut it down. And it's like, guys, don't you get it? They can't. They would have done so a long time ago if they could. And so now the only strategies they have left is to highly regulate it. And so by regulating it, and they can put a number of obstacles in people's way in terms of, making it really awkward. I mean, if you invest in Bitcoin and then you want to sell it, the rules in terms of how you need to manage that are just so unbelievable. Even if you want to accept it as a form of payment in your business, you have to keep a record of what was paid to you what the fiat currency value was when they paid it to you. You then have to keep a record of what the price rise was when you sell it and pay a portion of tax. I mean, unbelievable. So regulations are one way of kind of putting an obstacle in your path, and they can't shut it down. I mean, a lot of people for a long time were speculating on the fact that China, a lot of the mining, which is part of the Bitcoin protocol, is centralized in China. And so they were speculating that all China needed to do was shut it down. Now, just a few months ago, China decided to ban all Bitcoin miners from the country. And so one of the reasons for the recent dip in the price is because all of their miners have had to relocate. So even though China made rules to say you can no longer mine in the country, all they did was up sticks and move somewhere else in the world. It didn't shut Bitcoin down. It just meant that China has now, China had a huge opportunity and they just shot themselves in the foot. But this is what happened. This is what's going to happen as government is constantly chasing their tail, because this is the key to completely change the system. In many respects, Bitcoin was the final shot that killed the diplodocus, but it doesn't know that it's dead yet because the blood hasn't yet reached its head. It's like a slow, painful death. And, just the whole dynamics of the system are about to go through a really profound fundamental change, which means that, money's going to operate differently. It is definitely going to restrict what governments are able to do in the future, which will have a direct effect on how much funding is available for NHS dentistry. And as a result, private dentistry will be the only thing that's left, but it's going to become much more competitive. But as a result, that will bring the price down for patients. But the other problem is, individual patients are going to have to be negotiating a whole new environment for how to manage their finances and things like that. And what you have to recognize is that healthcare has been allowed to evolve exponentially along with the government. Healthcare was a lot smaller before governments got centralized control of it. And so if something's going to come along that restricts the power and the ability of government to fund these things, it is definitely going to restrict the funding and the ability of healthcare to operate in the same way. And so healthcare is destined to change profoundly. I think it's important for healthcare professionals to be aware of that. It's really difficult to know how these things are going to play out, but
yeah, we just can't imagine that happening. And if it happens, and all these NHS dentists will actually carry on to the last day, they won't jump ship to private until they are forced to do it, basically when the contract is completely pulled and they cannot operate under a non-existent contract.
yeah.
So my thinking is that this is a many years in the making yet, because I can't see a sudden change to Bitcoin out. Although I'm hearing more and more about altcoins and people investing and joining Coinbase and joining Binance and all of these, people, the lay person, everyone knows about it now.
Mm-hmm.
So there's definitely a huge change. It's catching up.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not so sure when will the government lose the power per se.
Yeah, but it's very difficult. Yeah, it's very difficult. And of course, a lot of people have been conditioned to believe that the government is going to last indefinitely. But I think the main point I would make here is that, the government is facing a huge crisis in terms of how they're funded and how they operate, and that will have a knock-on effect on healthcare. And it's really, the most difficult thing with this kind of thing is timing. Since 1971, people have been predicting a crisis of the fact that the currency is no longer tied to gold, and so when is this crisis going to come about? And we've seen a number of crises. You had the 1987 stock market crash, you had the financial crisis in 2008. A lot of people thought that 2008 was that defining moment, but they were able to keep it going for another 10 to 12 years. So if you were all prepared in 2008, you'd have exhausted your resources, waiting for the whole thing to play out. So in many respects, I'm giving you a very broad overview of what's actually happening here. And hopefully I'm giving it to you soon enough so that, hopefully the crisis isn't going to happen tomorrow, but so that you can start making plans. You understand the trajectory that the world is moving in, so that at least you can start thinking differently. And, for my NHS colleagues, especially the ones who are suffering, you really need to start to understand you've been really manipulated and taken advantage of here. And the only way anything is going to change is when you take your power back. And hopefully by giving you this broad overview, I'm helping you to see that it's not your fault. You have been taken advantage of. And until someone points that out to you, it's totally understandable why you wouldn't have figured that out for yourself. But now that see this as your impetus for starting to look into how to do things in a different way. Now, in many respects, although we've started talking about Bitcoin technology, Bitcoin technology and also, a lot of the other digital currencies are still very much in their infancy. When you understand it from a technological point of view, you can see how it's going to happen in the future. But if the whole world needs to rely on Bitcoin tomorrow, it's not ready. But the important thing is, it's like Pandora's box has been opened. The trajectory has been set. I think there's going to be a transition period where some of the government services will continue to exist. But I think you really start to need to get to a place where your future business plan or your personal business plan does not rely on the government, because the government is dead. It's if you're relying on that for your future, you are kidding yourself, and you're really setting yourself up for unhappiness and desperation in the future. You really need to start to take ownership of your own lives, your own resources, your own communities, and start to figure out a different way. Because if you continue to expect that what you've got is going to get better, you are kidding yourselves.
Right. On that note, I mean, we need to start thinking about some side hustles, don't we now?
Well, side hustles, the digital currencies, some people have done extremely well. You have to recognize that they're volatile, though, and that is in tandem with what's going on with the financial system. So in many respects, you need quite a sophisticated understanding if you're going to get involved with them at all. If you are going to get involved with them at all, maybe just a little bit as a hedge for the future. And there are lots of resources online. I've got a little bit of information on my website that I'm continuing to build on, which is designed to help individuals to understand it and to get involved with it. And ultimately, I'm working on how businesses can start to use it as a payment method, because ultimately, I think that is what's going to free society. I think, when businesses are starting to accept it as a payment method, and to accept it as a payment method in preference for everything else, once they understand why they should do that, it kind of becomes obvious, but it's still hidden from a lot of people at the moment. So there's more work to be done there. So really, my role right now, the way I see it, is education, helping to highlight to people, why this is important. I haven't got all the answers, but I can point you in the direction of some of the others. My newsletters try and keep people up to date with what some of the big issues are that they need to be looking at and exploring further, and trying to help. Some people are very focused on how to trade the different cryptocurrencies, and there's nothing wrong with that. Some people can build a side hustle just by doing that, but that's not for everybody. My focus is the fact that this technology, I think, is going to change the world. And I think ultimately it will be a good way, based on how I understand what the problems are in the existing system. But I also recognize that some people need help in understanding that. Which is one of the reasons I wrote my book. It took me 20 years to figure this stuff out. And so it was just, and I also started accepting Bitcoin as a payment method in my business. So just going through that process helped me to understand a number of other issues and, what's going on in the wider world. So my focus, I would say, is much more on the philosophy. And, it's very easy as well to kind of focus on the problems. But once you've defined the problem, the most empowering way forward is to figure out a solution. So by helping explain some of this to you, what I'm trying to do is help you to navigate the environment. I'm helping to kind of give you a roadmap. This is what the problems are. These are the ways in which you've been disadvantaged in the past. And this is a tool that hopefully is going to help society and also healthcare professionals move forward in the future. Because if you understand what's actually going on in the wider environment, you can make a choice. Is dentistry still going to give me what I thought it was going to give me when I chose to study this as a student? Because what you expected in terms of a nice car or a fancy house may actually, already it's not played out in your reality. Now, if you develop certain skills, it can still give you that, but is that still what you want? And actually, if the world is going to be changing so profoundly, maybe there are some ideas here of how to move it forward, because this network is in its infancy. A lot of people who work in banking and financing, they've got a brain drain into this new industry right now, and you really need clever, smart, but not just clever and smart, but also ethical people who are keeping an eye on this network to make sure that it continues to function in the way that it was intended. Because what tends to happen, a bit like when the health services were first introduced, they catch you with the idealism. It's like the NHS, this is what's going to help the poor and the weak and the suffering. And in the first few years, it worked incredibly well. But the trouble is, the longer these systems exist, the more chance there is for them to be corrupted and manipulated. And so the more people who understand the fundamentals and are there to help nurture and grow this system from the beginning, the stronger it will be. And so don't delegate this responsibility to other people. Get involved, find the niche that appeals to you, do what you can to kind of build this network. And if nothing else, understand what the new foundation will be, so you can start thinking about new ways in which healthcare can be delivered that does help the poor and the suffering and those who have fewer resources, but in a different way. Because the problem with government is they screw it up for you. They've been doing it for the last 20 years. And if you rely on them to fix it, it's not going to happen. At some point, you have to wake up and smell the coffee. If they haven't done it before, what on earth makes you think they're going to do it in the future? They've already shown you what they're capable of. So sitting back and relying on them to fix the problem, especially when they can't agree amongst themselves, because the problem is, as I was saying, in the other interview, they do these pilot projects, which are set up by, very capable people in order to create the ideal new system. And then what happens is it's presented to the government and they cherry pick what suits them, not necessarily what suits the rest of the profession. And even though we think as a profession we're in the minority, because we all disagree with each other, there's no consensus as a way to move forward. And so the government wins. So I think the only thing that's going to break the system here is when the government is now struggling for resources and is going to continue to struggle for resources. They've completely destroyed the financial system and have done it even more by creating extra resources to fund the pandemic. They're now scrabbling to try and find that funding just to cover for that extra currency that they've created. And this has been happening for over 100 years now. It doesn't work. If it works, it's not in the favor of the population. So, the beauty of Bitcoin is it gives the population the ability to take power back into their hands, and to figure out a different way forward. And so, again, that's why I wrote my book, to kind of give you a broad outline and a guide as to, why you want to move in this direction, and to give you a foundation of understanding so that you've got more understanding what's going on, rather than just dismissing it, going, oh, I don't believe in that load of nonsense. This is profoundly important. It's going to change your life whether you get involved or not. So you're better off understanding it now.
Understanding it early rather than later.
Yeah.
So I've got a link to your book, which on the British Dental Action Group, we've got members, we've got membership, and I've got all the emails. That's about 500 people, and I can send out the links to these webinars and to your book. And so if you haven't got your membership, it's www.britishdentalactiongroup.com. Register with your name, email, and GDC number, and I'll send you all of this out. There's also the Facebook group, British Dental Action Group, on Facebook, so you can become members on that. We do daily discussions and posts on there too. So we'll leave it at this with Victoria today. And if you've got any questions and you would like Victoria to do another webinar on a specific topic, just email us. Once you've got your membership, send me an email and we'll organize part 4. Thank you very much, Victoria, for all the time today.
Oh, you're welcome.
Certainly enlightened me, at least, and I'm sure there's many others who have also hopefully seen the light. We'll plod along, but with an open mind, I think, at this moment in time.
Perfect.